Okay, let's dive deep into something pretty fundamental for understanding modern society. Secularization.
Hmm.
The whole idea that religion might be losing its grip.
Right.
And if you're listening as a sociology student, this stuff is gold. We've got sources here offering loads of different angles on why this might be happening, or maybe why it's not quite that simple.
Exactly.
So our mission today, pulling straight from these sources you've shared, is to really unpack the key explanations, look at the evidence that pushes back, and see how it all looks different across the globe.
And I think the sources make it clear right away. This isn't just a straight line down for religion. It's changing shape, it's adapting. Sometimes it even intensifies in really surprising ways.
Yeah, definitely sounds like there are some potential aha moments here that could challenge how you, the listener, think about faith today.
Absolutely.
So let's start at the beginning, the definition. How do the sources actually define secularization?
Well, at its core, they describe it as the process where religious beliefs, practices, institutions, they lose their social influence, their significance.
Okay, and how is that measured? Like practically?
You measure it by things like, well, declining church attendance, fewer people identifying with a religion, and religion generally having less sway in public life, in government decisions, that sort of thing.
Seems straightforward enough. Fewer people in the pews, less clout in politics. But the why? That's where the sociology really kicks in, right?
That's the interesting part.
What's one of the big explanations the sources offer?
Well, one of the most foundational ideas goes back to Max Weber. Rationalization.
Rationalization, okay.
Weber argued that with modernity, the Enlightenment, you get this disenchantment of the world.
Disenchantment. Sounds kind of like the magic draining away.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It means that instead of looking to, religious or supernatural causes for things, we increasingly turn to science, to logic, rational explanations. This process, sometimes called desacralization, it means the world feels less governed by sacred powers and more by, well, predictable, observable laws.
So science explains the weather, medicine explains illness, less room for divine intervention.
Precisely. As empirical evidence becomes the gold standard, faith as the main way of knowing tends to decline, and that leads to less belief in traditional religious ideas.
Okay, so rationality pushes out belief. That's one angle. But then Steve Bruce comes in with a different perspective, focusing on what religion does for people beyond just the spiritual side.
Yeah, Bruce highlights these non-spiritual functions. He talks about cultural defense and cultural transition.
Okay, let's take cultural defense first. What's that?
That's where religion acts like a shield for a group's identity. So if a community feels its culture is threatened, maybe they're an ethnic minority in a new country, religion becomes a really vital way to hold on to their heritage, their language, their sense of collective identity.
Ah, so it's like a social anchor when everything else feels like it's changing around them.
Exactly. And cultural transition is related, but a bit different. That's more about religion helping individuals navigate big life changes, like migrants moving to the UK, for example.
How does it help?
The religious community provides an instant social network, support, familiar rituals, structure, all in a place that might feel very unfamiliar.
It's providing that sense of belonging, community, really practical needs, actually, whether someone's deeply faithful or not.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's shift to Grace Davy. She offers one of the most famous counter-arguments to this idea of simple decline, believing without belonging.
Right. Davy's crucial. She argues that even if formal church-going is down in places like the UK, it doesn't automatically mean belief itself has vanished. People might still hold religious or spiritual beliefs, just without formally joining or regularly attending services.
So they might tick the Christian box on a form or say they believe in God, but they're not necessarily in church every Sunday.
Exactly. And she brings in this fascinating idea of vicarious religion.
Vicarious religion.
Yeah, the idea is that there's an active religious minority who practice sort of on behalf of a much larger, more passive majority. This minority keeps the institutions going, performs the rituals.
And the majority can kind of dip in and out when they need it, like for hatch, match, and dispatch baptisms, weddings, funerals.
That's the idea. And the sources mention how during moments of crisis, what Davy calls interruptions to normality, like, say, 9/11 or a major natural disaster, even the pandemic, you often see a temporary surge in religious interest or prayer.
Suggesting the belief, or at least the cultural memory of it, is still there, just maybe dormant for most people most of the time.
Precisely. It's still part of the cultural toolkit.
But then this gets really interesting because Abby Day's research seems to almost flip Davies' concept. She talks about believing in belonging.
Day's work really adds complexity, especially looking at the UK. She found people identifying as Christian, but not necessarily out of strong personal faith. Instead, it was more about wanting to feel they belonged to British culture or a certain social group.
So it's the desire for belonging that leads them to claim the religious identity, not the other way around.
That's the suggestion. The sources mention Day's types: natal Christians, identified through childhood rituals; ethnic Christians, like immigrants affiliating to feel more integrated; and aspirational Christians, claiming belief for perceived social benefits, like being seen as good parents.
Wow. That really highlights how fluid religious identity can be. It's tied up with culture, social standing.
Maybe more than deep theological conviction for some.
Okay, and then there's Peter Berger, adding another layer, religious pluralism.
Right. As societies get more diverse religiously, think of the UK today with so many different faiths and denominations side by side.
You'd think more choice equals more religion, but Berger says no.
Berger argues it creates a crisis of credibility. When you've got multiple competing claims about ultimate truth all around you, no single one can easily maintain absolute authority.
How does that work?
Well, it creates uncertainty. If your neighbor follows a totally different faith but seems perfectly happy and moral, it kind of undermines the claim that your religion holds the one exclusive path. It makes absolute commitment harder.
So the sheer variety weakens the hold of any one tradition. That's a really powerful sociological point.
It forces choice, maybe doubt, in a way that wasn't there when one religion dominated the landscape.
Okay, so we've unpacked several key ideas about why secularization might be happening, rationalization, changing social functions, shifts in belief versus belonging, the impact of diversity. But as you said, the story isn't that simple. What evidence do the sources offer against the idea of religion just fading away?
Well, first, going back to Davy, the very persistence of vicarious religion and those surges during crises suggest religion still holds symbolic importance. It's a cultural resource, even if dormant.
Like a language people haven't forgotten, even if they don't speak it daily.
Good analogy. And there's something that early theorists couldn't have foreseen: the internet. Helen's work highlights how the digital age is completely reshaping religious engagement.
How so?
The sources make a distinction. There's religion online, which is basically existing religious organizations using the web, websites, streaming sermons, social media pages; traditional religion using new tools.
Like a digital notice board or pulpit?
Pretty much. But then there's online religion, which is arguably more radical. This is where individuals form new kinds of spiritual communities online. Forums, Facebook groups, networks where people discuss beliefs, find support, explore spirituality, often completely outside traditional structures.
That's fascinating. So religion isn't just dying, it's migrating and morphing into new online spaces.
It suggests adaptation and diversification, not necessarily straightforward decline.
Okay, speaking of different contexts, let's jump across the pond. The U.S. is often held up as the exception to European secularization, right?
It really is a different picture. Hadaway and others did research showing this big gap in the U.S. between how many people say they go to church, around 40%, and what researchers actually observe. The real numbers are lower.
So are people just, lying about it?
Well, the sociological take isn't really about lying. It's more likely social desirability bias. In many parts of the U.S., going to church is tied up with respectability, community standing, being a good person.
Ah, so people say they go because they feel they should, or because being a churchgoer is part of their social identity.
That's the idea. It's about presenting a certain self, fitting in. And Bruce adds another layer here with his concept of secularization from within.
What does he mean by that? Within the church itself?
Exactly. He argues that to stay popular, to keep membership up, many American churches have kind of watered down their traditional beliefs and demands.
How does that look in practice?
The sources suggest a shift away from, say, complex theology or strict moral codes towards messages focusing more on personal development, happiness, therapy, even prosperity.
So religion survives, maybe even looks vibrant, but its core spiritual authority, its ability to really challenge people, gets weaker.
That's the argument. It becomes more therapeutic, more about feeling good, perhaps less distinctively religious in the traditional sense. It adapts to fit the consumer culture.
That's a really sharp analysis. It survives by becoming more like everything else.
It's a powerful example of religion changing shape under pressure, not just vanishing.
Okay, let's widen the lens even further now, because the sources really stress that secularization isn't some universal global rule. It looks very different outside the West.
Absolutely. Norris and Inglehart's existential security theory is key here. They argue that religiosity tends to be higher in societies where people feel less secure.
Less secure how?
Less secure in terms of basics, healthcare, economic stability, personal safety. Where life feels more precarious, religion offers vital comfort, answers, hope.
So, strong welfare states, like in much of Europe, provide a buffer against insecurity, making religion less necessary, whereas the U.S., with weaker safety nets, remains more religious.
That's their explanation. It's not just modernity itself, but modernity combined with robust social support that correlates with lower religiosity.
Makes a lot of sense. If the state provides security, maybe the need for supernatural security lessens.
Then you have Stark and Bainbridge, who are even more forceful with their religious market theory. They basically say secularization is a myth, mostly based on looking only at Europe.
A myth. They just reject the whole idea.
Pretty much. Their view is that humans are naturally religious. We seek answers to big questions. We desire supernatural rewards, like an afterlife. Religion meets these fundamental needs.
So it's like a market. If one brand of religion fades, another will pop up to meet the demand.
Exactly. They see it as a supply and demand situation. They even talk about secularization cycles. Periods of decline aren't permanent. They're often followed by revivals, new movements emerging. They'd point to things like New Age spirituality as evidence.
So we're hardwired for belief, it just finds different outlets. That's a direct challenge to the rationalization idea.
It absolutely is. It starts from a different premise about human nature and takes a much wider global view.
And talking about strong reactions and new forms, the sources bring in religious fundamentalism, a really significant response to secularization and modern change.
Yes, fundamentalism is a major factor. The sources define it as this return to strict, literal interpretations of sacred texts, a belief in absolute, unchangeable truths, often involves resisting mainstream secular society, pushing back hard against liberal social changes, gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights, things like that.
It sounds like digging in your heels against modernity.
It's often framed that way. And it's important to note the sources mention that some groups may use shock tactics, even including terrorism, to make their point or assert authority. We're reporting that impartially as presented in the material.
Right. And Giddens links this directly to globalization.
He does. The idea is that as liberal cosmopolitan values spread globally through media, migration, it can feel like a direct assault on traditional ways of life for conservative believers. Fundamentalism then becomes a defense mechanism, a way to resist this perceived cultural invasion.
So globalization doesn't just homogenize, it can trigger this intense reaction to preserve difference in tradition.
Exactly. And Cassels adds another layer. He talks about identity formation in postmodernity. Faced with global flows, some people adopt a resistance identity, turning inwards towards fundamentalism to defend a threatened tradition. Others adopt a project identity, embracing change, maybe exploring alternatives like New Age movements.
Two contrasting responses. Retreat or explore. Makes sense. And Bruce categorizes fundamentalism too, doesn't he?
Yes, he draws a distinction based on the sources. Western fundamentalism, like parts of the Christian right in the U.S., he sees as mainly a reaction to internal changes, secularization and liberalism within their own society. Whereas third world fundamentalism, referencing certain Islamic groups, for example, he frames more as a reaction to external pressures, perceived attempts by the West to impose its values. Again, that's the distinction laid out in the sources.
So the source of the perceived threat, internal or external, shapes the response. Context matters.
Hugely. And Davey makes the crucial point that this mindset isn't just religious. The sources talk about secular fundamentalism.
Secular fundamentalism, like political.
Exactly. Pointing to some far-right movements that show similar traits. Rigid adherence to tradition, strong opposition to liberal change, often framed around national identity or cultural purity.
That's a really important connection for you sociology students listening. The pattern of fundamentalism, this rigid resistance, isn't exclusive to religion. It can show up in political ideologies too.
It's a response pattern when core values feel threatened.
Okay, so we've seen decline, adaptation, resistance, resurgence. What about clear examples where religion seems to be actively thriving by engaging with modernity, not just fighting or fading?
Oh, the sources give great examples. Nanda's work on Hinduism in India is fascinating. Despite India's huge economic growth, a rising educated middle class things you might think would drive secularization. Hinduism is booming.
That seems counterintuitive to the rationalization idea.
It really does. Nanda describes how religious leaders have cleverly adapted Hinduism. Instead of just focusing on traditional asceticism, they have promoted a version that actually embraces wealth and consumerism. Being successful and prosperous is seen as a sign of divine blessing.
Wow. So religion has found a way to coexist with, even sanctify, modern capitalism in that context.
It's adapted its message brilliantly to the new economic landscape. Another key example is Burger on Pentecostalism, especially its incredible growth in South America, places like Brazil.
Why has Pentecostalism taken off so much there?
Well, the sources highlight its emphasis on a strong work ethic, personal responsibility, economic self-improvement. It often focuses on achieving blessings and success in this life, which really resonates with poorer communities or people aspiring to move up economically.
So it offers spiritual meaning and a kind of practical theology for getting ahead.
Exactly. It provides a sense of agency, a framework for striving that connects directly to people's material lives, much more so perhaps than some forms of traditional Catholicism in the region might have.
It makes itself incredibly relevant. Okay, we have covered so much ground here, pulling from all these different sources. We've looked at theories for secularization, arguments against it, how it looks different in the UK versus the US, global reactions like fundamentalism, and examples of religion adapting and thriving.
And the big takeaway, the synthesis from the sources, seems clear. Secularization isn't this simple one-way street towards religion disappearing everywhere. It's much more complex.
Right. Well, traditional forms might be declining in some places, like parts of Western Europe.
That's definitely not the whole picture. Religion persists. It finds new forms, new online spaces, it adapts its message, and it remains incredibly powerful, especially in societies undergoing rapid change or facing insecurity, particularly in the global south.
Belief systems are just incredibly adaptable, aren't they? They respond, they evolve, they meet these fundamental human needs for meaning, community, security.
They're dynamic.
So for you, the listener, the sociology student trying to get your head around this, the key really is using multiple lenses. You need Weber, Bruce, Davy, Day, Berger, Helland, Norris and Engelhardt, Stark and Bainbridge, Goodens Castells, Nanda, all of them.
You have to consider the context local, national, global.
And really pay attention to how religion weaves through identity, economics, politics, technology, power. It's messy, it's complicated.
It definitely challenges easy answers.
Absolutely. Which kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, all these theories, examples of adaptation, reaction, how might the massive global shifts happening now, things like climate change, AI, increasing political polarization, how might they reshape religion and belief in ways these sources couldn't even anticipate? What totally new forms might emerge? And how would you, as a sociologist, even begin to study them?
That's a great question to carry forward.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.